All right, everyone, it is 2 o'clock. Good afternoon. My name is Caitlin Harder. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications at Leadership Connect. We are very excited for our co-sponsored event with the Government Relations Association, taking a deeper dive into the world of government affairs. In our previous webinar, we heard the need and the desire to better understand what happens after the initial relationship building with congressional and state legislatures. Moreover, people want to know how organizations fast-track progress with federal and state governments, associations, local organizations, and more in a world that seemingly moves slower than desired. Our esteemed panel before you will touch on their personal strategies from stakeholder engagement to leveraging public-private partnerships to achieve their organization's goals and help the government work more effectively together. In this hour, we hope to answer a few questions like, what is the first step to expediting their initiatives in a cross-cutting manner? How federal entities, associations, and companies can create solutions to problems in our nation? And finally, how their relationships enabled them for success. Now, the exciting part, our panelists. Maribel, why don't you start introductions for us and share more about your experiences?
Great. So good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank Caitlin and Juniper and everyone at Leadership Connect for pulling together such a great panel this afternoon. My name is Maribel Ramos, and I'm the Legislative Director for Health and Human Services here at the Office of the National Governors Association. I bring more than 18 years of experience working in state government and also the Hill, working on a number of different policy areas such as education, appropriations, immigration, cyber, and health and human services issues. Throughout my time working for 3 Virginia governors and 2 U.S. senators, I have had the opportunity to work with nonprofits, think tanks, and public interest groups. In my current role, I work directly with state and governors' offices in assisting them in all issues that pertain to health and human services. Most recently, our big focus has been on the response to COVID-19. This has entailed working with states on a number of issues, including testing, supply chain issues, vaccine distribution plans, therapeutics, and a host of other issues that have been brought up due to COVID. In addition, I track, monitor, and analyze legislation and regulation on issues important to states. For the past 2.5 years, I have helped to manage daily pandemic and disaster response task force operations here at NGA and help build gubernatorial consensus on matters under the task force jurisdiction in order to guide our federal advocacy efforts here at NGA. The work that governors and their staff have done in response to the pandemic is incredible. COVID-19 was unexpected and really challenged how we all work together from a federal to a local response. NGA was also engaged from day one with governors to support their work and advocate on their behalf from additional funding, more FMAP dollars, ensuring states had sufficient PPE, testing, vaccines, and therapeutics. We worked very closely with our federal partners, with our local partners, think tanks, and public interest groups. Because this, as you know, was an all hands-on approach. We had to find ways to be innovative and also quick in our response. We started off by organizing calls with governors in the White House on a weekly basis to ensure that information was being provided in a quick and effective manner. This was also an opportunity for the administration to hear directly from governors on what they were seeing on the ground and how they could be helpful. Before joining the National Governors Association, I also worked for 3 Virginia governors in different roles. I worked in the policy office and then also was the director of intergovernmental affairs for Governor McAuliffe in DC. For those not familiar with this position, you're not alone. Most governors' offices have a director handling state federal affairs for their offices. Some are housed in DC and some are housed back in their state. As the director of this office, I was part of the governor's executive branch. We were a small office of 3 to 4 folks. My responsibilities were really representing the governor before Virginia's congressional delegation and also advocated on federal issues of critical importance to Virginia. During Governor McAuliffe's tenure, he was also elected chair of the National Governors Association, where I served as a staff lead for the association to other governors' DC offices during his tenure. We also led Governor McAuliffe's work as chair of the National Governors Association, managed his NGA cybersecurity initiative. So every chair of the association comes up with an initiative that they spearhead for that year-long chairmanship. I know we were asked to limit our intros, so I hope I did that in the amount allotted. I will now turn it back to Caitlin. Thank you.
You did wonderful, and your career history is going to be fantastic to hear throughout this conversation. So we're really looking forward to it. Now, Doug, please share more about yourself.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you, Leadership Connect, for doing this. My name is Doug Friednash. By way of background, I've spent my career at the intersection of public and private sector. I started out working on campaigns in college and law school, and then following law school, I worked as an assistant attorney general here in Colorado. I was a state legislator after that. A few years later, after practicing law, I became the city attorney of Denver under current mayor Michael Hancock in his first term. Went to Brownstein, where I'm at now. I'll talk about that in a sec. And then Governor Hickenlooper, who's now Senator Hickenlooper, asked me to be his chief of staff. And I did that. And actually, I was chief of staff to the governor during his second term and started when he was chair of the NGA and really had a great experience working with the folks there. I then came back to Brownstein, where I chair our state local government relations practice group. We have offices in different states and have a 50-state platform where we work very close with governors, attorney generals, mayors, legislative leadership, as well as we have a pretty big office in DC. We're the biggest lobbying firm by revenue in Washington. And I will give a story briefly. You asked about how we cross-cut multiple governmental entities to solve an issue. While we haven't solved it, there's a current one that I think is a pretty good example of how we've been able to layer different parts of our government relations practice to meet a specific need. And the example would be safe banking. Currently, under federal law, banking institutions can't legally provide banking services to legitimate cannabis businesses, even in states that have laws, which is approximately 47 states have some kind of legalized cannabis in some form. So businesses that touch the plant, grow, work in this industry are locked out of the banking system. They can't make payroll. They can't access credit. They can't maintain checking accounts, accept debit and credit cards, meet payroll. It's very complicated and the risks are real. We see public safety risks. We talk a lot as a society about creating more equity and diversity and ownership opportunities. It's hard to do that when folks can't get access to services. So what we've done, this has passed the House. Safe Banking Act passed the House of Representatives 6 times. It got added on to the American Competes Act. It's in conference committee. If that moves forward, we're hoping that it gets on the final version. And how do we try to navigate that? We do that by different ways. We specifically lobby members of the conference committee that we think may be willing to adopt this. And we've used different layers of our local practice groups to do that as well, working attorney generals to write letters to the Senate and the White House. The same with working with governors and having them lean in and talk about some of the public sector risks that they see in their states with safe banking and the need for access. We have governors reach out to members of the Senate, key members, to talk about this as well. So both in terms of letter writing, and the same is applied with mayors as well. And the final piece would be, you look at the lineman of self who is similarly situated to your clients that have the same needs, that can reach out and accomplish the same thing and be on message and try to deliver the message, whether it's bankers, title companies, real estate companies. There are a lot of folks that want to see safe banking passed, that, we don't need to necessarily get to legalization at this point, but safe banking is a really important step. So I think that's a good example of how we cross layer these opportunities and try to solve issues on a federal level. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. That's a great narrative and something that we can all keep our ear to the ground for as it possibly moves forward. So moving on, Lisa, tell us more about yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Lisa Bullion, Executive Director of AIAI, and AIAI is the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure, quite a mouthful. But what we do and what we are is a public-private partnership, education and advocacy association, so P3s. We focus on best practices, and our members are leading financiers, developers, contractors in the United States, and they've worked on virtually every P3 here and abroad. So bridges, tunnels, courthouses, schools are becoming more popular, K through 12. Our mission, though, is to support government agencies, elected and appointed officials, as they determine the best way to deliver their critical infrastructure to their communities. So one of the challenges we have encountered with P3s, and quite frankly, the reason we exist as an association, we started 10 years ago, so it's our birthday this year, was the misinformation and lack of education around P3s. The model has been successfully utilized across the globe, and yet here in the States, there was a tendency to be suspicious of it as a procurement tool. So our goal when we set out was to address the misinformation and provide education, information, workshops, so that our public officials could make these decisions having all information they need and bring best value to the taxpayers. In order to be successful in our mission, it meant being able to get in touch with those folks who were responsible for building America's infrastructure. And just to share an early example of success, and Doug, we talked about this earlier. Early on, we became aware of some legislation that was not good for P3 in the state of Colorado, and we did a lot of outreach. AIAI leads a P3 coalition in DC. So we reached out to the governor's office and we talked to them about the legislation, how it would adversely impact the ability of the state to continue or effectively utilize P3s. And again, connected with other associations and organizations and had the conversation. And we were able to work with the governor's office and staff to talk about some of the negative implications of the legislation and offer ideas on how to achieve transparency that the legislators were trying to achieve in their legislation. This resulted in a veto of the bill and an executive order that addressed the concerns. So it was an early win for AIAI and a win for P3s because Colorado is truly a leading state for public-private partnerships and a great example of how you utilize the model to bring value to its residents. And our efforts there were a great example of outreach and connecting with other agencies, associations, local businesses, and really talking through how we can be successful together. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And working together already, I see this conversation going very well. All right, Brian, last but not least, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Leadership Connect and all of our panelists here today. It's good to be with everybody. My name is Brian Tynan. I'm a corporate vice president for government relations for AECOM. AECOM is one of the largest engineering consulting firms in the world, and headquartered here in the US. And we have a presence in virtually all states and territories, and do work everywhere. And my history, and I'll come back to the company, but my history, I've worked in largely in transportation and infrastructure related policy for my entire career, 27 plus years, working in a variety of capacities, from working on Capitol Hill for a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, to representing various infrastructure organizations, including the American Public Transportation Association and predecessor companies to AECOM. So over that time, working on issues like your typical transportation, highway, transit, bridges, water, environment, energy, buildings, et cetera. If you think about the broad breadth of infrastructure that's out there, working on the authorization and appropriations processes in Congress, but also working on the general implementation and the advocacy for those investments at both the federal, at the federal, state, and local levels. So I think that experience and that time, that exposure, everything that we do when you're working in the infrastructure space really is intergovernmental. Federal funding and state and local interests, and as Lisa alluded to, the private sector and private financing, all those elements come together, and it's always a broad swath of considerations that factor into how projects and how programs get implemented. So that's what I find interesting and exciting. It's practical. It's on the ground. It's real to both, I think, policymakers and to the American public. So that's what really interests me in what I do. We get involved in a lot of exciting and interesting projects. Amongst those issues, I mean, it's tough to pick any one story over the course of projects and programs that you've worked on. I think to allude to one in particular was really just the working with the transit industry on the authorizations that have been required to ensure that they had the funding in place and the policy in place to move their projects. Those efforts, if you think about transit agencies, they themselves are, sometimes they're a state agency, sometimes they're a purely local agency, and sometimes they're regional in nature. And more and more transit agencies have bi-state structures. They're crossing over state lines, serving broader communities, and those issues all factor in. And so I've had the opportunity to be able to work with the public transportation community, both as a lobbyist, both in-house, and now as a consultant with AECOM, helping them move their priorities forward it's a diverse industry in terms of interests, from the largest rail and rail transit properties to some of the smallest little bus systems that are still serving their communities in very positive ways. So all of those issues factor in, and it's even when you wind up talking about environment issues, when you wind up talking about energy issues, and even security issues, and we've had the opportunity to engage with TSA and Homeland Security on some of the security interests for the transit industry. So with that, I don't want to drag that along too long, so I'll yield back to the team and address some more issues as we get down the pike.
Thank you, Brian. And I was going to say, we're coming at you with specifics later, so I certainly hope to hear more about that. So now that we know our esteemed panelists, we're very excited to move forward with some questions. We've catered questions to each of their backgrounds, and hopefully we'll create a wonderful conversation. And I would like to kick it off with everybody's favorite subject, COVID. Maribel, you have been deep in the trenches working with COVID funding, and we would love to hear more about your successes that you've had working with the Governors Association, and specifically with the governors in relation to how you share this information with the federal government and just all of the successes around each project you've had.
Great, thanks for this question. It's been more than 2 years, so there's a lot of lessons learned throughout the pandemic and the response. COVID has been a very unique experience working with the federal government, states, territories, locals, and outside partners. As I mentioned in my introduction, NGA quickly coordinated calls weekly or sometimes twice a week for governors and the administration. I found these to be very effective because it was an opportunity for the governors to hear directly from the White House on actions being taken to respond to the pandemic. It was also a good opportunity for governors to voice their concerns as to what they were seeing in their particular states. So having this avenue of direct communication was key, and it was something that NGA was early on able to produce for governors. We also found COVID unique in the sense that it really made governors from all sides of the aisle work together, since they were going through similar challenges in their states. One example of this partnership was in states accessing personal protective equipment, PPE. And this was early on in the pandemic. Acquiring PPE was a huge issue that states and territories were facing. There was a lack of visibility of what existed in the stockpiles and how states and territories could access. That was a huge issue for a lot of states. States and territories had to quickly get creative and innovative in their approaches. They had to turn to each other, private industries, and anyone who would donate in order to get respirators, gloves, and other supplies to doctors, nurses, and other frontline workers. States and territories also faced bidding in a global marketplace for the supplies, where it was highly competitive and expensive. This also pitted states against each other, their own hospital systems in other countries, also against the US government at times. One approach that a few states took was forming regional alliances to create greater purchasing power or sending excess supplies to hotspots. So a lot of the times with this information sharing and states talking to one another, they learned, for example, one state may have more of supply of a certain, whether it's gloves or masks, where other states may have a need for those. So they were able to share this information and actually, get supplies moved from one state to another. In addition to calls with the White House, we had these calls for governors to talk with each other without federal partners on the call, to share some of the frustrations they were facing and what we as their association could do. As a result of these calls, governors agreed on a dollar figure for states to respond to COVID-19. So in addition to the state and local COVID dollars, we were also requesting an additional bump on the federal Medicaid assistance percentages the states were receiving full flexibility for female public assistance, and also extending the use of Title 32 for National Guard operations in response to COVID-19. So as a bipartisan organization, NGA was able to effectively advocate on the Hill with the administration. The relationships we have with governors' offices and getting their full buy-in is critical in relationship building and also trust. In addition, bringing in outside partners was incredibly important on issues such as ensuring states had PPE testing or sufficient vaccines and therapeutics. NGA also followed up with having a number of briefings and calls where we brought in outside experts, federal and local partners to provide assistance to states. So, this is, I think, a good example. I know everyone is sort of tired of hearing of COVID, but I think as we're heading into sort of a post-pandemic and once the public health emergencies expire, states will be left with dealing with a lot of sort of issues that have only been exacerbated due to COVID. So I think that's one example, Caitlin, of where working with states and governor's offices and our federal partners as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like y'all have laid the groundwork for whatever comes next with the lines of communication and really setting yourselves up for success, even in the darkest of moments. NGA's really positioned themselves well. So I think this is going to be really wonderful to see what y'all do in the future. Speaking of funding, our favorite subject matter of infrastructure, it's one of the most recent bills that made it to the desk of the president. And Brian, we would love to hear more about your expertise and some of the challenges you face working across state, tribal, local communities. I know AECOM has been involved in this process, and we would love to hear specifics about what y'all are doing with this.
Sure, thanks, Caitlin. And it was, I really appreciated Maribel's comments on the NGA's role in COVID, and I have to, congratulate, the NGA and all the organizations like it, but NGA was critical to just keeping the information flow and keeping coordination going across the board. AECOM was very involved with a lot of COVID response and, standing up alternative care centers and supporting with supply chain issues and things like that. So the governors were critical in that effort, and just really appreciate everything that was done on that regard. But to the question that you've raised here, as I said in my intro, infrastructure has so many requirements of just the inner collaboration between governments, between the private sector. This infrastructure bill had been building for many years. The industry has been arguing for the needed investments across all modes of infrastructure since the last major transportation authorization, the FAST Act, which was passed at the end of 2015. So we've been making the case, and then sure enough, this product is on the table, and it required, I think, a partnership between all levels of government. Again, the governors, the mayors, the cities, the counties, all combining with the transportation industry, with the water industry, with, again, the private financing crowd like AI, talking about the importance of the advocacy itself. Just takes a long time. And I always describe the infrastructure bill as, the coalition of support that was behind this was immense. This was not like one segmented category. We had folks in all categories, labor, business, et cetera, supporting this effort. And still, it took years and years of advocacy to get it across the board. And I think what that leads to is, even for issues like infrastructure that in and of itself is not complicated, it does take some time to get the case made, especially when you're dealing with finance, when you're dealing with this was a big, expensive effort as well. But the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, those bills require a lot of effort, and they do have some complicated and technical issues. There was innovation included in the bill. There were new ideas. Transportation electrification is one thing that AECOM has been an advocate for so long, and we were strongly supportive of provisions in the bill for transportation electrification in particular, and some other climate-related investments, as well as the key water investments that sometimes get overlooked. As people say, water issues are often underground, and the American public doesn't know about the pipes that are under the ground. So a lot of education, a lot of communication, a lot required in advocacy to change hearts and minds, and to get even something that seems pretty obvious across the goal line.
Awesome.
So with that, I'll turn it back. Sorry.
Well, you just let us right in. I think Lisa was nodding along, and she certainly could provide some of the answers to the next question, because you're trying to reach a lot of people, and you made this very clear, Brian. This is a complicated endeavor. So Lisa, I know you're in this space, you're deeply ingrained. Tell us about how you reach these people, public, private, whomever you need to get in touch with, and what's the biggest barrier here? Tell us about it.
And Brian, thank you. It's a great time to be in infrastructure. It's an exciting time. It's a great time for AI because there was a lot of mention of public-private partnerships in the bill and leveraging dollars, and leveraging funding. And AI was very successful. We were able to get what we call infra labs in the bill, and it's the Rural and Tribal Assistance Program, and that's really, infrastructure is built at the state and local level. However, there is a need from the federal government to provide, I guess, assistance, and what we pushed for was assistance in the form of not funds, but expertise. So grant money, so states and local governments could get the assistance they need to look at different ways to deliver infrastructure. A public-private partnership adds on that life cycle value of operations and maintenance when you're looking at roads or buildings. So there's a little bit of a different twist to how you deliver those projects than traditionally delivering them. So getting that expertise and that assistance through Build America Bureau, because it is largely a transportation bill, but through Build America Bureau, it enables us to get the states, local government, cities and counties understanding what they need to do things differently, so that in 10 years, the work they're doing today is still well maintained. So connecting those dots, getting the information out to state and local government on what's available. For us, it's hugely important to have access to contact information, figure out who's doing what, help them look at their capital programs, and connect the dots. Another association we connect people with is Accelerator for America, National Governors Association. I was just speaking with some folks there on particular issues. So really it is all interconnected, just as infrastructure is interconnected. I mean, if you look at broadband now, you're looking at K through 12. It's all connected, and you need to bring all folks together to deliver. So I'm not sure if that answered, but I'm really excited about this bill, and I'm excited that we have the opportunity to work with the cities and counties to get some work done.
Fantastic. And so we've all touched on this a little bit, and I think this is really interesting to bring it back around to Doug, but you've worked in the state governments, you've worked for the federal government, you've touched all that the eye can see here in Washington, D.C. So please share, how have you seen states influence federal policy, as alluded to by Maribel, and can you share specifics?
Sure. Well, I think there's just a lot of collaboration that you see that takes place among these groups, even on this panel. I think, great examples, you've seen increased influence. You've seen a lot more activism, education, as Brian said, and advocacy. I think, maybe the best example is pandemic aid. I mean, I think, take Colorado, for example. Colorado received roughly $65 billion from 22 different federal programs, which on average is probably about $11,000 per person. That's a lot of money. It was unprecedented funding and opportunities. And it came through a lot of different ways, and various clients that we represent, whether they were interested in the Paycheck Protection Program. We worked hard on that, both in terms of getting funds and helping people access those funds, restaurant revitalization funds, the shuttered venue program, the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure that we've been talking about as well. There was a lot of money that was delivered, and you saw work being done. Take state and local governments by way of example only. Cities and states were lobbying that, as were clients. They wanted to see, money come to the states. There would be opportunities that flowed from that. And once that got passed, you work hard and get as much money as possible for, states, cities, and counties and tribal organizations. And once you've done that, you then work on the Treasury Department to, work on the rules as they implement rulemaking. You want as much flexibility as possible for cities and states and local governments and tribal organizations to give that money out, disperse that money. And you saw just this confluence of different groups, organizations, governmental entities looking for help in this unprecedented time that we went through as a country. And then, so the lobbying at the DC level might be for infrastructure, it could be for technology, it could be for all these different things. And then when the money flows down, you then have another set of lobbying that takes place with state, local governments, on behalf of clients looking, they have a solution. They may have IT or broadband solutions. They may have, mitigation for wildfire, things that might be able to access, transportation infrastructure. And they want to work decision makers in different states to go ahead and put money in specific programs, to educate them on programs, to think about how they can utilize these funds. Some states probably saw more money than they could spend. But so being, at that level, being able to talk to decision makers and try to direct money for programs was something that was really important for clients. And I think we've seen influence on an unprecedented level during this time period. And it really created some really unique opportunities, and it still is creating opportunities as states and counties and cities are trying to still spend some of that money. And now they might be putting out RFPs for technology needs or different needs that they have now that they've approved for funding for behavioral health or whatever the specific issue is. So it's really created some unique opportunities for states and local governments to influence the federal level, and for for companies, businesses that are also, and individuals that are also interested in and seeing some of that flow their way.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Doug was saying. I think, definitely a lot of opportunities were created with a lot of the COVID funding. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've seen is that this is one-time funding for states and locals. So being careful as to how the states and locals use the funding, just keeping that in mind, that in future, this is just one-time funding. If you're going to hire staff, figuring out how to maintain that long term. So I know that's a huge issue that we had heard from states on. I think the other one is just that there was a lot of funding out there in all areas, and because this was coming to states fast, and a lot of these funding had specific timelines that they had to be spent by. So keeping all of that in mind while dealing with the pandemic, I think were definitely challenges that states and locals had to face. And one of the things I think from NGA's perspective that I think we do well at the Center for Best Practices, we do a lot of sort of best practices and highlight where states are utilizing some of this funding, and also partnering with our private-public partners, where they can use some examples of how states are utilizing this funding and highlighting that and sharing those experiences with other states, bringing together. Also, sometimes we do policy academies here. One specific example, I think the recent example we've done is with workforce. I mean, there are tons of workforce challenges that states are facing. Some states are doing some very unique things. So sharing those experiences and expertise with other states, I think is a key way that we try to sort of highlight what other states are doing here at NGA.
And if I could add on to that, again, going from the COVID, American Recovery Plan, relief effort and everything that state and local governments were doing to try to, apply those funds that were available and still are working in many cases to look to utilizing those dollars, and then into the funding coming out of the infrastructure bill. That's an enormous amount of information that our clients, at varying levels of internal capacity, staff capacity, that they have to interpret the laws, to evaluate what's required of them to access funds and to comply with the requirements of the funds. Those issues, the more, I think one lesson out of all of this over that whole time period is the more information that federal agencies in particular that are, doling out the dollars, the more information, and then for organizations like NGA that did such a great job of information sharing and best practices. And what we've seen is that there's a hunger for information. I mean, people really, they need to know, they want to know what the solutions are, how do they access it, how do they comply, and across the board, that has been a real, I say a challenge, but also an opportunity. Those programs that have been better about pushing out the information and doing it in a timely way, I think are seeing more response from especially the local government clients in particular.
Right. And if I can, and just going back to Maribel, where you talk about best practices and policies, one of the things we do at the association is connect agency to agency when we're dealing with infrastructure. Someone who's used a model to leverage their dollars and build a courthouse in Maryland, we've connected them in Oregon to those folks because they're building a courthouse. And that, best practices and lessons learned really goes a long way as folks are, connecting with each other. And I think with the infrastructure coordinators that are now being appointed across the United States, there's great opportunity because they're connecting and forming groups and learning from each other as well, figuring out how they can do more with the funding they're receiving, how they can deliver on the critical needs, the infrastructure for their states. And another area that we're focused on at AI is what we call S4, which is safe, secure, sustainable schools. And we're seeing the K through 12 schools delivering on their infrastructure needs, building new schools. Prince George's County is building, I think, 6 schools in 5 years and has another tranche coming, but delivering on the needs because COVID did show us that we weren't really prepared for virtual learning, and it kind of is changing the way we need to develop and design our buildings. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but we're seeing a lot more connectivity among the different sectors and agencies to learn from each other.
And with that being said, and so many points were made across this, how have y'all adjusted your strategy to increase your reach? You have so much information to share with your stakeholders. Doug, I see you nodding your head. What have you done to adjust your strategy?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's all about relationships. First and foremost, you have to develop really deep relationships, and you have to build trust, and you want those relationships long before you need them. And that's really an important point. When you're knocking on the door for the first time with an issue, it's a really steep curve for you. So you want to do it. And the way we've done it, I mean, we build bipartisan relationships on every level, on a federal level, state, local. It doesn't matter who's in control of Congress or legislatures or governors. We build these relationships. We're at every NGA event. We're at DGA, the Democrat governors, Republican governors. We do that with the AG Alliance, the Democratic AGs, the Republican AGs. We're at those events. And we send, former AGs to those. And we generally have the same group going to different things. We do it with mayors, the U.S. Conference Mayors, Democratic Mayors Alliance, Republican. I mean, it's all about relationships. It's building these relationships long before you need them and being available. And some of that is just the repetition of people going back. And it's not just the governor, it's their staff. I can give you an example of having run into a governor's staff person that I became very close with in a different state that we don't have boots on the ground. But when I have an issue in that state, that person is incredibly responsive and will usually point us to the right person. So these relationships really make sense and are really helpful to clients. And again, these are really great organizations and they do an amazing job of connecting people. And the other thing to think about too, I would say, is some of these groups, provide sponsorship opportunities. And part of that gives you the ability to have your issue highlighted. So you may want to meet with a governor at one of these events or a couple of governors, or you may want to flag an issue that is kind of a cutting edge issue that they're interested in, the organization's interested in. You can, use that tool to help highlight an issue or have an issue discussed in a more robust way. So I think those are really things we've done and really invested in to create that 50 state opportunity and partnership.
I have to agree with everything Doug said. I mean, we engage to a great degree in many, if not all, and maybe some more organizations that Doug and his team do. And I agree. I mean, it's important to be out there and AECOM as an organization, we're a solutions-based organization, and oftentimes you're bringing these solutions to the table, and people need to, it does require those relationships to get people to understand what it is that you're, to give you the time to talk things through. I mean, one of the things that we are working on right now what is digital AECOM. It's digital solutions to many challenges, from water asset management to even the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We've got a new digital tool that helps clients match up the funding streams and uses artificial intelligence to do it, and shows how they can fit their projects into those funding opportunities. We're applying other digital solutions to the actual planning and environmental review process to make them more efficient and more accessible to the public. So, when you bring those, we talked a little bit earlier about innovation, and when you bring innovations like that to the forefront, you have to have those relationships, and it takes time. Again, a lot of communication, a lot of education. It all takes time. So sometimes it's hard to get past the time involved with just making the connection and educating people on it.
Go ahead, Maribel.
I was just going to add I agree with everything that Brian and Doug just mentioned. I will just say that I think, coming from NGA is a bipartisan organization. So I think our relationships have been strengthened in the past couple of years. We are members of the Big Seven, which not sure how many folks on the call are familiar with Big Seven. I can't, probably not a lot. I know I wasn't before I joined NGA, but the Big Seven is made up of the Council of State Governments, International City Management Association, the National Association of Counties, the National Council of State Legislators, National League of Cities, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So we often get together and try to find consensus on specific issues, whether it's infrastructure or COVID-19 funding. If there is consensus on a specific issue, then we write a letter or issue press statements. So I know that's, one particular issue, way that NGA has really engaged on more of a local specific issue area. I know one of the most recent examples is a letter that we sent to Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy endorsing the bipartisan state, local, tribal, and territorial fiscal recovery, infrastructure, and disaster relief flexibility act, which is Senate Bill 3011. It's a bill that's co-sponsored by Senators Padilla and Cornyn, and this would provide additional flexibility in the use of the CSLR FRF funds, which are the state and local recovery funds through ARPA. So this is one way that we come together with more of our local partners that's sort of encompassing mayors and more local governments in trying to find some consensus and advocate on behalf of a specific issue.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left, and we have 2 questions from the audience that we'd like to get to. So the first one that was asked was, how does one convert their state legislative and government relation skills to the federal level when trying to pivot careers?
I'll jump in on this real quickly. I will say this. I have my colleagues in DC, and we have some folks that have been chief of staff to Pelosi or McConnell or been legislators, and they really sometimes focus in on specific people or committees. I actually think those people that worked on a state level have greater skills. And I won't say this to my colleagues, but I'll say it to all of you, because you work everyone. Like in Colorado or California or New Mexico, you're working every member, you're working the administration. You have to know every potential issue for a client, and you need to know how to connect those dots. Often in DC, it's a little more specialized. And I think if you have those experiences on a state level, that's really going to inure to your benefit on a federal level. The ability to, have all those experiences and then use that muscle and skill to really navigate federal issues or a specific issue, and gives you a lot more bandwidth, actually. I think it's a great background to do federal work.
Thanks, Doug. And then the second question from the audience is, we've talked a lot about pandemic and infrastructure issues. What topics do you expect the most intergovernmental action to happen on in the next few years? If you had a crystal ball, which I'm not sure any of us do.
I think from my perspective, I know we are looking at everything post-pandemic, right? Lots of issues that have been raised and just sort of exacerbated due to COVID, whether it's mental health issues, education issues. I think we're going to see a lot of these play a huge role. I mean, we're seeing a lot of action in Congress right now on mental health. So I think, you know, just looking at sort of my portfolio, I think health is definitely going to be huge. And, you know, we're seeing some action. We'll see what happens with the gun legislation right now in Congress. You know, who knows what's going to happen there, but I think those are a few issues that I can foresee.
I think without beating the infrastructure horse dead, I think there's a lot to happen that still needs to happen on the energy side of things. So I think and some of that is impacted by investments that were included in the infrastructure bill, but I think that you're going to see, again, climate issues remain, concern. We've got issues like drought and water needs out in the West, and climate resiliency on the East Coast. And so I think all those issues will play into additional needs on the energy front, and there's so much technology and development that's occurring. It's probably a smaller issue in the grand scheme of things, but I do think that that's going to continue to be something that folks pay attention to.
Thanks, Brian. And I think in closing, I wanted to ask everybody on this call for one last piece of advice. If you were to share one thing with everyone on this call who wants to either grow in this space or form relationships, what's the one piece of advice? What should they prioritize? Where should they start?
I mean, just at just high level, get the right, and we are here, and you guys were kind enough to bring us together, but getting a service, getting the right information that you need to do the outreach you need to do. When we reach out to schools, we talked about our S4 initiative, we're able to get names and find out who's in what role, and just create those connections where we can then begin developing relationships. I think it's hugely important to have the right information at your fingertips when you need it. Another example of that is we'll see an article in a local paper about a project they're looking at, and they may do a P3. Well, you know what? That's a great opportunity for us to go to our database through Leadership Connect, pull up that person's name and send them a note and say, hey, what do you need to know? We're here for you. We're here to support you. So for me, the relationship, and Juniper has been fantastic, the relationship with Leadership Connect has really been very helpful.
And thanks, Lisa.
You're welcome.
I'll just quickly add to what Lisa mentioned. I think the networking is definitely key. And something that Doug had mentioned early on is don't wait until you need something from someone to reach out. Make those connections early on is important, because you need to establish that relationship and trust beforehand.
relationship, the networking early on in your career is critical. I wound up working for a gentleman who had when my boss on Capitol Hill lost his reelection, I wound up getting a job with the guy that gave him his first job 30 years before that. So the circles and the connections, and became friends with my intern coordinator, who also helped me with opportunities down the road, and just, creating relationships. That's those connections are key, always.
Agree. And I just add one more. I mean, you got to really know your audience, know who you're talking to, know what their viewpoint might be, create a narrative that might align with it, but always tell the truth about it. But definitely know your audience.
Awesome. Well, we are at the 1 minute mark, and I wanted to say, on behalf of Leadership Connect and our whole team, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. We will be following up with all of you who attended with takeaways from this event, and we cannot be more grateful for those on this call. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.